The world is on fire. Cities reduced to rubble, millions of lives lost. And the outcome of the greatest war in human history teeters on a knife's edge. Amid this chaos behind closed doors, a single meeting, shrouded in secrecy, rewrites the future. This is the story of a covert agreement that altered the fate of nations and forever shaped the course of history. But what was this agreement? Who were the masterminds behind it? And why was it kept hidden from the world for so long? To answer these questions, we must travel back in time to the 1940s, a time when trust was scarce, alliances were fragile, and every decision carried monumental consequences. By 1941, World War II was in full swing. The Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy, seemed unstoppable. Europe was under Hitler's iron grip. North Africa was ablaze with conflict, and Japan's imperial ambitions stretched across Asia and the Pacific. The Allies, an uneasy coalition of democracies and communist regimes, were struggling to hold their ground. Britain was battered but resilient. The Soviet Union was reeling from Hitler's betrayal, and the United States, though not yet in the war, was watching nervously from across the Atlantic. The stakes were existential. The world's future hung by a thread, and desperation often leads to deals that would otherwise seem unthinkable. Tehran, November 1943. It was the first time Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, the leaders of the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States, would meet in person. But this meeting wasn't just about military strategies or post-war reconstruction. Beneath the surface, it was a battle of ideologies, egos, and survival instincts. Each leader had their own agenda, and trust was in short supply. The Soviet Union, after bearing the brunt of the Nazi onslaught, demanded a second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on its troops. Stalin had grown impatient with the Allied delays, suspecting them of wanting the Nazis to bleed the Soviets dry before stepping in. The United States, on the other hand, was cautiously planning for a post-war world where its power and influence would eclipse that of the old European empires. And Britain, once the world's greatest empire, was clinging to relevance, knowing that its days as a superpower were numbered. It was during this tense summit that an agreement was forged, one that would tip the scales of the war, but plant the seeds of future conflict. Tehran wasn't chosen randomly. Iran was a neutral country, but its strategic location made it a hotspot for Allied interest. The Allies had already invaded Iran in 1941 to secure its oil fields and establish a supply route to the Soviet Union. By the time of the Tehran Conference, Iran was effectively under Allied occupation. But there was more at play. Iran's significance in this agreement wasn't just geographical, it was symbolic, a testament to the lengths the Allies would go to secure victory. What wasn't discussed publicly was a secret understanding that involved Iran's post-war future. The Soviets wanted guarantees for their influence in northern Iran, while the British sought to maintain control over its oil-rich south. Roosevelt, the mediator, sought to ensure that American interests wouldn't be sidelined. The result was a tacit agreement. Iran's independence would be formally recognized, but its resources and strategic position would remain under the shadow of the great powers. But the most consequential secret agreement wasn't about Iran, it was about Poland. This was a nation that had been invaded by both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939, triggering the very war that now engulfed the world. At Tehran, Stalin demanded that Poland's eastern borders be redrawn to favor the Soviet Union, using a pretext from an obscure 19th century treaty. Churchill, ever the pragmatist, agreed, recognizing the Soviet Union's dominance in Eastern Europe as inevitable. Roosevelt, too, acquiesced, prioritizing Soviet cooperation over Poland's sovereignty. In exchange, Stalin promised to join the war against Japan after Germany's defeat, a commitment the Allies desperately needed. This secret deal sealed Poland's fate, condemning it to decades of Soviet domination and marking the beginning of the Cold War even before the Hot War had ended. While the Tehran Conference was critical, it wasn't the only moment of secret diplomacy during the war. Another shadowy agreement took place a year later at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. By then, the Axis powers were collapsing, and the Allies were already carving up the post-war world. At Yalta, Stalin extracted even more concessions, including influence over Eastern Europe and a guarantee of territorial gains in Asia. Roosevelt and Churchill, eager to ensure Soviet participation in the Pacific War, agreed to terms that would later haunt them. But these agreements came with a cost. The promises made in secret were often at odds with the public declarations of freedom and self-determination that the Allies championed. This hypocrisy wouldn't remain hidden forever. As the war ended, the world began to learn about these clandestine deals. The revelations sparked outrage in countries like Poland, which felt betrayed by the very powers that had promised liberation. The secret agreements also sowed the seeds of distrust that would define the Cold War. The Western Allies had underestimated Stalin's ambitions, believing they could contain him through diplomacy. Instead, they had handed him the tools to build an empire. Meanwhile, the Iranian people grew increasingly resentful of foreign interference, setting the stage for decades of tension between Iran and the West. But not all the consequences were dire. The agreements forged at Tehran and Yalta, however controversial, were instrumental in securing Allied victory. The opening of a second front in Normandy, the D-Day invasion, was a direct result of Stalin's demands, and Soviet involvement in the Pacific War hastened Japan's surrender, bringing the conflict to a swifter end. Still, the question remains, at what cost? The secret agreements may have ended one war, but they also paved the way for another, a Cold War that would divide the world for nearly half a century. The story of these secret agreements is a reminder of the complex moral dilemmas that leaders face in times of crisis. It's easy to judge their decisions in hindsight, but in the fog of war, certainty is a luxury no one can afford. For the Allies, secrecy was a necessity. Public knowledge of these deals could have fractured their coalition and emboldened their enemies. But secrecy also came with a price, one that the world continues to pay to this day. As we look back on World War II, the Tehran Conference and the agreements forged there stand as a testament to the power and peril of diplomacy. It was a moment when three very different leaders, driven by their own ambitions and insecurities, came together to shape the future. Their decisions weren't perfect, and their motives weren't always pure. But in the end, their alliance held. And in a war where failure meant annihilation, that was no small feat. The secret agreement that changed World War II wasn't just a moment in history, it was a turning point for humanity. It reminds us that, in the darkest of times, even the smallest decisions can ripple across the centuries, shaping the world we live in today. The true cost of those decisions is a question we're still trying to answer. What do you think? Was the secrecy justified, or did it betray the very principles the Allies claimed to fight for? Perhaps the answer lies not in what was agreed upon, but in the lessons we choose to learn from it.